Have you ever seen a contract that excludes liability for indirect and consequential loss and assumed you're protected? Here's the problem. What you think is an indirect form of loss might not turn out to be, and that difference can cost you a fortune. I'm Mike, founder of Starlit Contracts. We are here to help you negotiate and use contracts with confidence, and today we're looking at indirect and consequential loss. Let's look at this important clause in summary now. The words indirect and consequential loss are often used to identify a category of losses that don't flow directly from a breach of contract or some other form of liability, but instead from some knock-on effect. So if your supplier delivers late and that causes you to lose a future deal, then your lost profit might be considered to be an indirect form of loss. But here's the twist. It's often unclear how a type of loss should be categorized because it can change depending on the facts and on the law that applies to your deal. In business-to-business contracts, it's common for a supplier to exclude their liability for any indirect and consequential losses that a customer may suffer. In other words, the supplier's reason to have such a disclaimer is to prevent the customer from being able to recover certain categories of loss if the supplier is in breach of the contract or has some other type of liability to the customer. But indirect and consequential loss disclaimers are often misunderstood. Many people think that having a broadly worded disclaimer will protect them against huge claims. But what's the reality? Unless the disclaimer expressly excludes liability for the risks that are most important to your deal, then you might still be exposed to claims for things that you thought were excluded. Should you care? In short, yes, especially when you're a supplier. An indirect and consequential loss disclaimer is one of the most important clauses to get right, because if you don't, then you may be exposed to considerable risk. Think about it this way. If you have a cap on liability, then, without the disclaimer, you could reach that cap quickly. Upon reaching the liability cap, the other party may want to terminate the contract. That said, it's probably even worse if you don't have a cap on liability and the other party can claim for all their indirect or consequential loss if you are liable. If you're a customer, then it's often less important to have an indirect and consequential loss disclaimer that protects you. This is because there are fewer opportunities to cause a supplier such losses. Even so, many customers want a two-way indirect and consequential loss disclaimer that protects them in addition to the supplier. Let's bring this topic to life with a case study. TechServe Limited is a software provider. They license a platform to 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿. Due to a coding error, the platform goes down. 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 loses a major deal as a result and claims $2 million in lost profits. TechServe claims they excluded consequential losses. But under the law that governs the contract, lost profits from non-performance can be a direct loss. Now imagine if TechServe had thought about their risks carefully. They would have identified that 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿 may lose business or miss out on profits if the platform stopped working. In this case, TechServe could have excluded their liability for 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿's loss of profits and loss of business by expressly listing them in an indirect and consequential loss disclaimer. In addition, TechServe could have stated that 𝐈𝐧𝐝𝐿's loss of profits and loss of business are excluded, whether such losses are categorized as being a direct or an indirect form of loss. This could save TechServe $2 million. But in this case, TechServe had a broadly worded disclaimer which they use for all contracts. The clause didn't take into consideration the specifics of their deal and didn't exclude their liability for 𝐈𝐴 loss of business or loss of profits. Depending on the law that applies to the deal and the related facts, 𝐈𝐴 is in a good position to argue that they should be compensated for their loss of profits. If TechServe's liability to 𝐈𝐴 is unclear, TechServe might even prefer to settle the claim rather than face the uncertainty and cost of a dispute. Now let's look at a sample clause together. Neither party is liable to the other for any loss of profit, loss of use, loss of savings, loss of data, or for any indirect or consequential damages that arise from a breach of contract, tort, including negligence and strict liability, or under any other legal theory. This sample clause may look strong, but here's some important points to keep in mind. First, don't rely on a generic disclaimer for indirect forms of loss. List expressly every type of loss that you want to exclude. Think carefully about the risks that apply in your deal and check example contracts in your industry for ideas. Consider adding losses in your disclaimer that you can't manage during performance of the contract or that would make you uncompetitive if you were to accept liability for that loss, and add a risk buffer to your price. Second, do you remember the comma that was after loss of data? It has a really important function and shouldn't be deleted. The intention is that all heads of loss listed before it should be excluded whether they are deemed to be a direct or an indirect form of loss. Third, be careful that your indirect and consequential loss disclaimer doesn't go too far. If you exclude liability for almost everything, then it increases the risk of the clause being deemed unenforceable. This can expose you to the types of loss that you want to exclude. So here's the big picture. Clauses that disclaim liability for indirect and consequential loss are most effective when you list the heads of loss that are relevant to your deal. Don't rely on a one-size-fits-all clause for each and every contract that you enter into. And remember to focus on the indirect and consequential loss clause even more, especially as a supplier, when you have a high cap on liability or no liability cap at all. For a short time, you can access the entire Build the Foundation in Contracts program for free on starlitcontracts.com. I look forward to seeing you there.